ActiGraphy, you may ask. What exactly is that? And why do pharmaceutical companies want to use it in clinical trials to measure whether their products work? Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm HealthBiz Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare entrepreneurs about their lives and careers. I'm here today with Jeremy Wyatt. He's chief executive officer of ActiGraph, and he can tell us all about what ActiGraphy is and a lot more. So if you like this episode, I really hope that you're going to subscribe, ask your friends to do the same. Jeremy, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thank you, David. Honored to be here and following some great folks that you've had on your show. I appreciate the opportunity to do it, sir.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about ActiGraphy, ActiGraph, and so on, but I want to talk about how you got there a little bit first. So, what was your upbringing like? What was your childhood like?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't often get asked those questions. We typically will jump right into talk to me about ActiGraph, and that tends to be where my life, it eventually gets to, right? But no, I appreciate that. I'm from a really small town, David, and actually, I'm pretty fortunate. I'm probably very unique in this space of clinical trials and academic research in that I have never moved away from my home city. Where I sit today in this office is less than an hour drive from my house, and it's about 1 mile from there to where I grew up. And so very rural part of Northwest Florida, and humble beginnings. My dad was really made music for a living. That's what he did when I was young, and then we farmed, and then he built houses. And so my summers were always full of hard work, working for him and his company. I have a half sister, but we didn't really grow up together. So for all intents and purposes, I'm pretty much an only child. And, but yeah, never left here. Was fortunate enough to have a family that supported me and went to college locally. And I'll talk about that in a little bit maybe, but my faith was a super important and influential part of my beginnings and also kind of where I'm at today. But yeah, it's kind of where I started.
Sounds very rooted. There's some people that are kind of move around in all different sorts of ways, and it sounds like you've been rooted. Now, what kind of music did your dad make for a living?
Yeah, so you may be able to tell by the accent, country and Western music was kind of the genre of choice. I grew up in the 80s, and that was the urban cowboy days. And
right.
So my father owned a nightclub, actually, where he kind of kicked off some of the urban cowboy movement here.
That's good. Did he have do you have like a mechanical bull and that kind of thing?
No, not quite. Not quite. But did have the band, and my dad plays steel guitar, and nice. You either love that instrument or hate it,
Yeah. Good. So talk a little bit about, some of those childhood influences. Are there things that you kind of learned in childhood or experienced that still influence what you do today?
Yeah, well, I mentioned my dad a few times. Both my dad and my mom very active and influential in my childhood, and still are today. And in fact, I just had lunch with them today. Very close with them. But they're both passionate. They never quit. They have a huge kind of presence in my life, but also very active in our community. My dad is very committed to helping others, and in his time of home building, he had an opportunity to just build great relationships with the community around us. And I watched him and how he did that in his life and put other people first. And that was a big influence in who I became, but also music, as I mentioned, was a huge part of our lives. And so I had an opportunity to play music for a while, when I was younger in my teens. And then my mom, just incredible work ethic. But there were some other dynamics in the environment that I grew up in that I think sort of between the two shaped where I landed today. I grew up in the Top Gun era, and so it's relevant right now with Top Gun 2 coming out.
Yeah.
But, I'm in Pensacola, and Pensacola is actually where they have Top Gun. And so the Navy Blue Angels are stationed here, and really large Navy presence here in Pensacola. And so that was a big influence on my life, and I wanted to be a pilot at a young age, and I ended up not going that route because of some vision issues. But I later pursued that and got my pilot's license at a later age. But I had always had some interest in microelectronics and how they can be used to control things and how they're used. And so I as a child, I remember asking my mom to buy me a CB or a walkie-talkie or some kind of wireless technology. And they would buy me a wristwatch. I don't know if you remember the calculator watches I had.
Yeah, I had that. Sure.
Yeah. I would take it apart and try to understand, how does this thing work? And invariably you'd open it up and there's like this black blob and you're like, what does that do? And so it just intrigued me. And then we had a career day when I was in high school, and I had a gentleman who worked for AT&T that took me on a tour of AT&T. And this was in the 90s. And so a tour of AT&T was very much about telephones and, relays and switches, but it just fascinated me. And it was right around the time that AOL was coming out and coming on the scene. And so those things really came together and put me in a position where I knew I wanted to do something in electronics, and specifically design. I wanted to design something myself. And so that pushed me in the direction of an electrical engineering degree, which I then pursued. And was a little bit of uncertainty when I graduated whether I would go down the path of becoming a home builder in the footsteps of my father, or if I would go down this path. And I remember the conversation well. We weren't sure where the economy was going to go, and he could see my passion for what I wanted to do. And so we made the decision. He supported me to go that path. And so that's sort of how I kicked off on that journey. David.
No, it sounds pretty good. I remember the CB radios. That was a big thing at the
Radio Shack had them.
Radio Shack, yeah. It was down there. I had one of those calculator watches too. It was a little stylus. I think it was the Casio. But before that, and I'm maybe a couple of years older than you, I got a calculator, but it was before a calculator was this real thing. And I remember it was called electronic slide rule calculator, so they had to relate it to the slide rule. And it's like, I don't know what a slide, I was like right in that era, like I didn't have the slide rule.
Yeah.
What is that? But it was, the calculator was still a new kind of thing. So
you're giving your age away there, David.
I know. Well, if people could listen, I know people could probably find it on the web if they wanted to. So you in education, you mentioned, you went to school locally. How did you figure out where you're going to go? What was that? What was that like?
That was a crazy story. I again, for small town, and most of the people I graduated with didn't go any further than 100 miles or something at most. It just, we didn't even, people talk about having a town where you had one red light. We didn't even have red light.
Yeah.
This was small. And I knew I wanted to pursue electrical engineering. And I had a cousin who had gone to the University of Florida, and she had pursued an electrical engineering degree. And in 1991, when she did, it was very rare for a woman to go through a program like that.
Yeah. And
I took a trip with my aunt. We went down there and visited her, and she showed me some of the work that she had done down there. And they were doing, if you go through and get an electrical engineering degree, you'll do what's called a senior design project. I think they call it a capstone project now, but it was essentially sort of this putting all your knowledge together to build something, which is what I wanted to do. And so when she was getting ready to graduate, I went down there and visited her, and she had built some sort of thing that monitored fish tanks. I don't even remember what it was now, but I was so impressed. And I came back and I told my family, I said, I want to go to the University of Florida. And that was just shocking. I mean, first of all, nobody in my family went to college, but I wanted to go to the University of Florida. So the next year, I got a mail, some kind of flyer in the mail from our local university here in Pensacola, University of West Florida, which has grown. It's a tremendous university, but it was growing at the time. And they said they were starting an electrical engineering program. And in order to start that program, they had invited the University of Florida to plant their program there. And they would kick off in 1994. And that's the year that I graduated high school.
Okay.
And so they actually brought in the same University of Florida staff that my cousin had learned under, and brought them in. And I just thought, well, Lord, if that's not Lord telling me which direction to go here. Yeah. So we did. So I signed up for that. And, there are those moments in your life, David, where you think, man, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And looking back, that at the time was the most challenging thing I'd ever done was pursuing that degree. It's a very challenging degree, but there have been several things since then that have eclipsed that, not the least of which is having kids. But certainly. So I graduated with that degree in 98. And then later went back and pursued an MBA degree. I found out I was much better at at being with people than I was with at being with components. And so went into management a little bit later in my career, and pursued that at the University of West Florida, which had a very mature business program by then. So yeah.
No, that's a good story. Now, early on, it looked like you were working in manufacturing technology. Was that your first first role out of school?
It was. So I put my resume out there, and a company that was in Fort Walton Beach, which was about an hour and a half from where I lived. They asked me to come in for an interview, and this company, MTI was the acronym. They were actually doing obsolescence redesign work for the government. So it's a very big military presence here in Northwest Florida. And essentially what they were doing, David, is they had, if you can imagine the F-15 aircraft, that particular platform was designed and built in the 70s. And so a lot of the electronics on that platform, they'll go bad, and they'll just go and they'll get some inventory and replace it. Well, pretty soon you run out of inventory because they don't make the components anymore to make this plane. And so this company that I took this job with, they were actually redesigning these old electronic components and circuit cards that went into that aircraft using new technology and getting that new technology requalified, revalidated to be used in the aircraft. And that was a great opportunity for me. I came in under a great mentor who had some experience, and I was very passionate about embedded systems and embedded code. And so that's what I was doing at the time. So that was my first job, and it was right out of college, great opportunity. And I kind of grew through there. So there about 6 years, and kind of grew up through that process and learned a lot about everything from laying out a printed circuit board to managing a project and getting all the milestones in a row to have it qualified. It was a great experience.
So, then it seemed like you had like a fairly logical and linear progression, and, maybe there's some divine intervention to bring University of Florida, close to your hometown and all that. But then I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile, and I see then Farmers Opry, which is not necessarily probably where most people go for manufacturing technology. So how does that help me understand that one?
Well, yeah, that always throws people off, and I get more questions about that on my LinkedIn than I do about ActiGraph.
I mean, ActiGraph is a good question. It's like, what the heck is that? But I mean, that's one thing. But okay, now Farmers Opry. Now I got to ask about that.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. So I mentioned the music background of my family. So when I was in my teens, I began playing guitar, and my dad's passion for music and for serving people together, those two things are kind of key to who he is. Those never left him. Those never waned. And so in 2000, he approached me and said, "Hey, look, I want to build a miniature Grand Ole Opry in our hometown."
Yeah, why not?
And and I said, "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard."
Yeah.
He said, "Well, look, when we were able to do music, before it was always hard, right? You always had to go to these sleazy clubs, and you had all these, people that would come in drinking." And he said, I want a nice wholesome place. And so we opened this restaurant / entertainment venue, and we served farm to table food to the patrons that came. And it was very much a destination, right? I mean, it was in my hometown, which is not exactly easy to get to, but we served farm to table food. And then we would do a 2-hour country and Western show every Friday and Saturday. Mm-hmm. And so people would come to the show and enjoy that. And it was there that I learned a lot about public speaking. I was the MC. I also played and sang. And so I tell people I learned more during that period of my life about running a business and interacting with people than I ever did, in my professional career. Yeah. But it was important. And we were open for about 12 years. And our band gained some local popularity, and ended up having an opportunity to do some really cool things. We played for 2 presidential candidates who came through our town.
Nice.
Doing some stumps, and an opportunity to perform on stage with some pretty large artists locally here that I look up to. So it was just tremendous. And then we closed in 2012. And the last show we did, we had an opportunity to invite a couple of people from the Grand Ole Opry band to come play at our facility. And so, but it was just a great time of my life. And I put it out there because I'm very proud of what we did. I think we helped a lot of people with that particular venue, and people that didn't have any, older people didn't have anything to do on the weekends, or just were looking for community. And I feel like, Lord put those people in my life, and it was just a really important time in my life.
So now ActiGraph. Now this isn't one of these things where, company was struggling and they said, I got to bring in a seasoned CEO. You started off there not as a CEO. So what was your, how did you get in there, and what was your, was your initial role?
Yeah, well, that's right. It's been a crazy ride, but in 2003, or maybe 2002, right around there, MTI, the company that I was working for previously, acquired a company called CSA.
Okay.
And I think it was like Computer Science and Associates. But
yeah.
It was essentially a small little firm made up of a few scientists who had won a government grant. And the grant was really around building, the government needed to build a product that could measure energy expenditure in Army Rangers during training so that they could qualify and quantify the number of MREs, or meals ready to eat, how many to feed them during training. That's literally where this thing started.
Okay.
And so these scientists had done that, and, had productized this wearable device at the time in 2001. This was a big deal. And we're using it or selling it into a few academic universities. And so the CEO of MTI, where I worked, he was friends with the guy who was in that company, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to retire. Do you want to, take over the company?" And they did. They acquired them, and they asked me. I had finished a project working on one of the aircrafts I mentioned, and they said, "Hey, will you take a look at this old technology? We'd like to maybe see if there's anything we can do with it." And so myself and two other really smart engineers I was fortunate enough to know at the time, we spent about a year and just took this product and we just made some changes to it, right? There was this archaic thing. It used I'm going to use a big word here, but it used a piezoelectric bimorph beam.
Oh, yeah.
This was a piezoelectric device that when it vibrated, it created a voltage, and used that as an accelerometer. And so we changed some things. We put a solid state accelerometer on there, and it had a lithium coin cell battery. We got rid of that and put a rechargeable battery. And so they said, well, we're going to see how this thing does. Let's try to manufacture it. And we did. And eventually said, well, we're going to spin this thing out as its own company, and it's probably going to fail. Do you want to go with it? And I was young at the time. I said, that sounds like fun.
Sure.
So I went. There were 6 employees, and we had a great leader, a guy named Jeff Arnett, who left one of the divisions at the company I was with and spun out as the CEO of ActiGraph at the time, and that was in 2004. And I was there as just a design engineer, and kind of helped design the first product or two, and then progressed from there into software manager. I had an opportunity. We needed some software engineers to build some tools for us, and so I knew a little bit about software, so I hired 2 people, and we began doing that. And I moved up from there to director, and we began to get more traction in the academic research industry, and that's our primary customer at the time. And moved from there to vice president, and then ultimately later, around 2017, was asked to move over to chief technology officer, where I had a chance to oversee both the hardware and the software division of the company. And I think that's where I really learned about leadership and how you could mess things up.
Yeah.
And then moved out of that into president, and then ultimately to CEO when the company was sold in 2020.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like something you've been sticking with it for a while. So let's talk about the company itself. So what is an ActiGraph?
Well, full stop. What is an ActiGraph, right? Yeah. Well, we're fortunate enough to have the name of the company is actually also the name of the technology.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people use the lowercase g, and I remind them that ActiGraph has a capital G.
Yeah.
That's right. But it's essentially just, it's rooted in the technology, which is a measurement device that can qualify movement and behavior on a person. And so today, most people are familiar with devices that are based in the same technology, like Fitbits and Garmin devices and Apple Watches. They all have some sensors in there that do that. We just do it at what we call a fit for purpose level, which means we are very much dialed into how our technology is used in the industry, and we really focus heavily on ensuring we do that with a really high degree of fidelity. Now,
you talked about how the product, the technology came about for military use. And then I know there's a lot of work that you've done on the academic side, but then increasingly where I've encountered actigraphy is with clinical trials. So how has the business shifted over time? And are you still primarily on the academic side? How does clinical trials fit in? What are the lines of business like?
Yeah, so we essentially have today two primary lines of business. The academic sort of research or funded or government funded research is still a very big and important part of who we are today. And so you'll find a lot of NIH grants that are studying human behavior, human movement. They're studying the effects of dieting, or they're studying the effects of treatment on movement, the effect of movement on treating things like obesity or treating things like sedentary behaviors. And so we're used a lot in that industry. And then the way we moved into clinical trials was a little unique, which is probably not surprising given anything I've said today. But
yeah, let me guess. Somebody was coming through town,
and something like that.
They needed to use needed a bite to eat on a Friday. They heard the band.
Yeah. I would love to give you that story.
Yeah.
There's an initiative in Europe called the IMI initiative, and it's a pretty large sponsor-funded group, and they essentially look for ways to improve the efficiency of clinical trials. And there was a group that came together in 2012 and began looking at COPD disease. And they essentially spent about 2 years, and their findings that they came out with from this consortium group basically said, look, in order to better measure the progression or regression of someone with COPD under treatment, we recommend the use of an ePro instrument, which is essentially a digital survey, in combination with an actigraphy device. And specifically, we recommend ActiGraph from Pensacola, Florida, because they've been used in a lot of academic research studies, and they have a number of publications out there that have been used to independently validate them. And so when that came out, we got a call from GlaxoSmithKline. This was in 2013 or 14. And they said, hey, we want to do a clinical trial in this COPD group, and we'd like to use your technology. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And I hung up the phone and I said, well, what is a clinical trial?
Yeah.
And we began looking at that and understood pretty quickly that, folks that are running clinical trials are much different than folks that are running academic research
yes, indeed.
Projects. And so spent some time designing some tools to really help, facilitate the use of our technologies in clinical trials. And today, here in 2022, we've done almost 300 clinical trials globally, and have about 20,000 peer-reviewed publications that reference our product directly or indirectly. So we've had a lot of good success in there, and a lot of that just comes, I think, from listening to the customers. I mean, that first GSK study was tough because I flew out to Jewish National Hospital in Denver.
Yeah,
and I had our academic device, and this is this big red clunky thing, and they said, this thing is great. It's just the ugliest thing we've ever seen. And I said, I couldn't agree with you more. And so, we had some work to do, but we've been very fortunate and blessed.
So, Jeremy, if you think about the first use case where the Army's trying to figure out how much food to send out based on how much activity people are doing, and then, the academic ones are going to use it for their various purposes. In COPD, this whole concept you're talking about ePro, so that's electronic patient-reported outcomes. A lot of it is, what's the functionality of the patient. I'm guessing that the reason for actigraphy there is to say, if somebody is undergoing treatment for COPD, it's a type of illness that really kind of slows you down, keeps you sedentary, and so on, and a good marker to see if somebody's actually responding to therapy. Are they able to move around and so on? Is that kind of the basis of actigraphy for trials, or help me understand that better?
Yeah. That's a great question. So, there are the key to this industry and our role in it is transparency and really what we call clinical validation, or being able to really qualify and quantify what's happening in a specific patient population group. So, if you're wearing an Apple Watch, David, you're wearing that for your own purposes, right? The purpose of that is to measure how active are you during the day, but it's also to tell you what time it is. And when your, daughter or son texts you to let you know that happened. Our technology and the algorithms behind it are designed specifically in the example of COPD. For that particular case, they wanted to look at step counts. And so we looked at step counts, but not just step counts, right? So if you've got I have an 11-year-old son, and if you watch how he walks and takes steps, versus my grandmother. They walk and take steps much differently. So the way that you interpret that data from that clinical population is different than you might interpret from a population that, say, has Parkinson's disease. And so we have focused heavily on being able to say at the end of a clinical trial, we have a lot of confidence that this data properly represents that population and represents how more active or less active they are after a particular treatment. And so that applies not only in COPD and the step counting example. I hate step counts, by the way, but that's another podcast.
Right.
But it also applies in areas that we work in around things like sleep. How efficiently are you sleeping? Things like how sedentary are you or not sedentary are you? How are you moving throughout the day? And so, that's a little bit about kind of how we do that.
Great. So, the mark of success, I think, of any company these days is when you get to the point where the private equity firms are interested. And I understand that PE firms became interested in ActiGraph at a certain point. What was that journey like? And has it been any difference in terms of a transition from, prior ownership to a private equity backed sponsor?
Yeah, well, I've heard that same rumor too, David.
Okay.
So
Good.
I hope it's true, right?
Yes.
So first I want to just say that I can't get enough credit to our previous CEO, Jeff Arnett. He was a visionary, and he did such a great job of just keeping us dialed into what we were trying to accomplish. And so, we never took any funding, never from the time we were founded to the time that the company sold. We didn't take $1 of funding, and he made it very clear that, if we were going to reinvest into the technology, that we had to create our own revenues to do that. And so I just really appreciate the diligence that he built into our culture here to be able to get to that point. And we're still that way today, even after acquisition. But we really saw a lot of growth in various therapeutic areas. And I mentioned a minute ago the example of COPD, which is a respiratory therapeutic area. But then we began to see interest in things like not just respiratory, but things like neurological disorders, where you have, ALS disorders or Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or Parkinson's disease or, different areas there. And so we saw that begin to grow, and we knew that we needed to sort of expand and figure out how to do better in each of those markets. And so the previous owners, Jeff included, he was one of the three, just decided, it's time for somebody else to take the baton and move forward. And at the time, I was serving mostly as the chief technology officer, and I moved into this transitory role as president. But then we met Archimed in 2019, and they're a French private equity firm out of Lyon, France, and just had really great synergies with them right from the start. And they came in 2020 and took majority share of the business at that point, and have just been such a great partner for us. They've not come in and tried to control the company. They very much believe in the vision and have very much been supportive on our kind of investments that we've made recently.
Well, that's great. So 2020 was also the year that another thing that I won't name started to come in.
Yeah.
And, you do actigraphy. A lot of it is about remote monitoring, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your office was a remote office to start with. And I'm just guessing that you've had some experience of that during those during the public health emergency. But how did you adjust your own operations, and how did actigraphy, did its role change during that time frame?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, first of all, I'll just say I don't recommend transitioning into a CEO role at the beginning of a pandemic. No. It's a bad idea.
Duly noted. Yeah.
Yeah. So, talk about, trial by fire. That was interesting. Fortunately, the first hire that we made post transaction was a great asset friend of mine, a guy named Scott Giannetti, who is now today our vice president of people and culture. That was the first hire I made, and I had known him for a while, and I just said, man, I need a partner here to help me through this. And so he came in at the right time. And then, as we walked into this, just being very transparent with the employees and saying, look, we don't know what we're doing. It's never been done before. But our priority are our employees, and, we want to make sure everybody is taken care of. And so, we put together this thing called a workplace manifesto, and he helped with most of that. But it was really around, look, you can kind of choose your path here. Do you want to go remote? Because we'll support you in that. Do you want to go in office, or do you want to go hybrid? And so we had a good read on who wanted to be where. But we were also hiring, David. I mean, we are essentially twice the size number of employees as we were in 2020 today. And so we've ramped up a lot. And so we had to take that into consideration around our strategy. And so we began to look at, well, what does it take to hire somebody out of state? What are the things I need to put in place, the tools I need to put in place, our meeting cadence and how we held that, the style of that, our town halls, we began to be intentional about monthly, went to weekly check-ins, moved our weekly check-ins to 8 a.m. to handle our India team who, it's the middle of the night for them. And so all those things we had to be very intentional about thinking about. But, as the CEO of the company, I'm trying to think about the strategy, the customer, what's right for them. How do we make that happen? I couldn't own that myself. And so I really depended on having a partner to do that. But then as our team began to grow, our executive team, we as a team began to own that, so that it wasn't all just one person. And okay, well, what's going on in this department? How are we feeling over here? What are the nuances of the culture related to our sales team that don't necessarily apply to our team who are in logistics, who have to be here every day? And how do we account for that? And so we made some adjustments, and fortunately got through. We were about 95% in office with 2 remote employees in 2020. And today we're about 30% in office with 50% of our employees local to the Pensacola area and 50% remote, both, nationwide and globally. Yeah.
Wow. So now that you've gotten through the transition to private equity ownership and the global health emergency and so on, you're looking ahead. What do you see? What are you excited about for the business?
Yeah, I'm excited about a lot of things. I really believe, in 2021, the FDA released some draft guidance around the use of what they call digital health technologies, or DHTs, in clinical trials. And it was essentially a guidance factor that kind of looked at the different areas related to cybersecurity, but also around the logistics and the technology. And when you look at that guidance, you see a lot of kind of our core tenets of who we are in the company and things that we've been supporting for years. So what that really signals to myself at ActiGraph, but also to the world, is that we are looking at as a nation at how we can do better in clinical trials, and we admit openly that the use of digital tools to do that is the right way if it's done the right way. So we still today, David, see things like the 6-minute walk test, which is used in a lot of neurological clinical trials as the primary endpoint. Yeah. This is a rudimentary measure that dates back to the 1950s, in which they asked patients to come in and walk for 6 minutes, right, and then they measure how far they walked. Well, if that patient's having a bad day, man, they just kick themselves out of the trial. Yeah. There are better ways to do this. And so we're excited about, we've already honestly seen how our investments in technology can help these patients. We can help the drug companies get these drugs to market faster, or decide they're not going to work faster. So we're super excited. And one thing that's different about ActiGraph is that we've not chosen one path and said, we're going to do this thing. A good example would be, like blood glucose. Yeah. We're not a blood glucose monitor, and we're not developing, we're actually developing tools that can be used in a lot of different areas as it relates to mobility, movement, and physical function. And so there's a lot of application here in clinical trials. And I think that we've got the right team, especially with the work we've done on our science team, the investments we've made there, to really help take that to the next level alongside and in partnership with our partners in pharma, our partners in academia, and our partners at agencies like the FDA and the EMA. So very excited about where that's heading. And then, there's an opportunity for us in healthcare also. As we look at how patients are treated post-drug release in phase 4 studies, and how can we, as a prescribed technology, be used to get ahead of things like flare-ups, or ahead of things like reactions to a drug, or maybe a drug's not performing the way it's expected to statistically in a population. Why is that happening, and how can we tweak that rather than running a new clinical trial? So a lot of great opportunities for us ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying about kind of the breadth of applications for actigraphy compared to some others. Like if you look at blood glucose, is generally just going to be applicable to diabetes, which certainly affects a lot of people, but nonetheless, it's not that broad. And if you think about, clearly you can see some places where, like your COPD example is fairly straightforward, right? If people are can't move. But the point that it's kind of a general indicator. Like if people are able to be physically functioning, that's a lot of what functional, cure or well-being is in any kind of an area. So it really does have a broad usage, and it's very correlated with what a patient thinks about it's important for themselves as their outcome.
I think sometimes the stretch becomes, a CRO or a drug company is accustomed to a type of measurement, and there's comfort there. We understand it. The sites are trained on how to do that. But there's really two types of actigraphy measurements, if I can, David.
Sure,
there's an actigraphy measure that's what you described, which is, let me holistically look at how this patient's doing. Are they more or less active in general? But then there's where we're at today, and technology has advanced quite a bit to the place that we're able to do things like look at gait measurement from the wrist. And when you talk about something like that, now we're getting closer to what someone would be comfortable with as a primary measure for an endpoint.
Right.
Because someone who has a disease like Parkinson's, their gait is going to be one of the first things that change.
Yeah.
And if we can look at that in their life and be able to identify and pinpoint, this is when it started, or this is when it changed, or, now we're able to get into some specifics of how and when the treatment is affecting and improving that patient's life. And so, technology has improved quite a bit. And I just think that actigraphy, and in particular ActiGraph, is really well positioned to give the breadth of the picture of what's happening in a patient's life without being overly burdensome. Anybody can put on a watch, or in some cases we ask them to wear it on a different location, but we're not shaving any chest or anything. I mean, it's very simple. And then we let the technology do the work and our science team do the work alongside it. So I think we're in a good position to scale that and really help our partners be successful.
So I want to turn back now away from the business and toward the personal side and ask if you have time for any reading, and if there's any books that you recommend or anything that you recommend we avoid.
Yeah, well, that's great. I try to carve out some time to read every day, and some of my favorite business books. My number one top business book, and this is probably cliche, but I'm a huge Jim Collins fan, and I just really believe that his work in Good to Great was just perfect at the right time. And so a lot of the principles that we follow here in how we hire, how we select people, and how we promote within come from his book Good to Great, and then alongside that, Built to Last. So that's a tremendous read. Another one of my favorites that we've actually taken up recently is Donald Miller's Building a Story Brand. And so in the case of ActiGraph and the industry that we're in, understanding the plight of the end user, the person that's working at Novartis that needs to use this technology, and kind of the inner dynamics of that company, and what that person who is a champion for your technology, what they're encountering as a leader in that organization, understanding that is crucial, and being able to tell the story the right way so that they have the tools and they are equipped in the right way to be able to support you. It's important. And that was a great book. And then it's just two that come to mind. Someone gave me the book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz when I first took over in this role. And I thought that was a great one also. So good ones I recommend. Ones I don't recommend, I don't like I'm going to offend somebody. I don't like the Navy SEAL books.
Yeah.
I think they're cliche, and a lot of times I try to get them to apply to me, but it's like I just struggle with those.
Yeah.
But look, you got to find time also for just some downtime reading, right? I've actually been trying to pick up some of the classics I didn't catch as a child, like Frankenstein. I never read.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, I want to say thank you for that, because, I usually just give that as like a little joke about anything to avoid, which I think is good because you save somebody some time, but no one really takes me up on it. So I'm glad that you did that, even at the risk of offending someone. But I don't if you offended somebody, that's okay. I did read a book. Somebody actually, so the Hard Thing About Hard Things is the number one most recommended book on this podcast. And once I heard it 2 or 3 times, I read it. And then there is a book, I think it's called Living with SEAL. And it's written by the guy whose wife founded Spanx. And I'll have to correct this if I'm wrong, but basically he had this Navy SEAL live with him, and train him for 30 days and just like kicked his butt, the whole time. And the book was a bit much, but I did read that one too. So it was, you got through it. I got through it. So I won't unrecommended, but I can see where you're. I see. So you should only read one such book. In any case, Jeremy Wyatt, Chief Executive Officer of ActiGraph, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today on the HealthBiz Podcast. You've been listening to the HealthBiz Podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.